I also mentioned the work that Nancy Wolf and I did about this horizontal syncytium, and she also had the idea that we start with the pyramidal cell in black with these sort of lateral dendritic connections to other dendrites, pyramidal dendrites by GAP junctions shown in the insert, also interconnected by GABA interneurons, which pace the coherent 40 hertz. And we have thalamocortical inputs, which in her idea, her original idea, bring the raw material from the visual field or sensory field in. And then the basilocortical cholinergic inputs kind of selected from that field for conscious attention, kind of like plucking the strings of a harp, if you will, to produce consciousness. So that everything was there from the thalamocortical input, but the cholinergic basilocortical inputs, by this decoupling mechanism eliciting a quantum state inside the neurons, selected which of the content, a possible content, would come into consciousness. So that's in that reference. It's also on my website. Let me address a few specific issues. Unconscious versus conscious processes. Most of what the brain does is non-conscious. Crick and Koch, for example, estimate that at any one time only 100 to 1,000 neurons are necessary for consciousness. And they have some evidence for that. Consciousness is the tip of an iceberg. Many lines of evidence indicate that the same neurons or brain regions are at one moment non-conscious and another moment conscious. There's no grandfather neuron or grandmother neuron where the signals goes to one place and lights up and that's consciousness. That's not it. There's the same neurons become conscious somehow, but we don't know what the transition or threshold is. From dreams, unconscious processes can be characterized to some extent. Carl Jung remarked that unconscious processes involve pure feelings. I found this very interesting quote from Mate Blanco, who described unconscious processes as where paradox reigns and opposites merge into sameness. And if you think about your dreams, this may make some sense. I found that to be a very interesting quote, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. Along these lines, I was interested to find out in preparing for this talk that Freud seems to be making a comeback. As you well know, he identified unconscious drives, aggression and libido, evident in dreams, which shape our behavior. However, these drives have been downplayed in favor of rational conscious processes, and dreams characterized as random mental static, if you will. I've always wanted to disagree with that because I always kind of liked what my dreams seem to be telling me. Anyway, Jack Panksepp, a neuroscientist at Bowling Green, who was at one of our consciousness conferences, found that stimulating a certain area, the ventral tegmental area in rats, caused a generalized seeking response. And others generalized this to the drives, looking for action, if you will. They weren't hungry. I don't know if they were bored. They were just looking to do something. They were driven. Using brain imaging techniques, Mark Soames found this same area, which is related anatomically to limbic and forebrain regions, the key to dreaming. So even though the area responsible for REM, that may just be the trigger, and that these areas that are responsible for emotion and drives are active in dreaming. So Soames remarked that Panksepp discovered as a neuroscientist what Freud had discovered psychologically. And now more commonly referred to as emotions, the modern suite of drives comprise rage, panic, separation, distress, lust, and a variation of libido, sometimes called seeking. This is from a poster presented at the Tucson conference from a Argentine psychiatrist, actually, called Freud's Take on Consciousness Revisited. And basically, her idea was that the red below the threshold, the drives, once they reached this threshold, became conscious, and psychic images appeared above a certain threshold. I thought this was kind of interesting and consistent with what previous scientists had discovered. Well, I'm going to turn now to what I think, and hopefully, in my mind anyway, it kind of ties it all together. And that's to talk about quantum physics. And this is where usually people fall asleep or don't want to deal with it, because as Richard Feynman said, anybody who claims to understand quantum physics is either lying or crazy, because it is truly, truly bizarre. For example, in the quantum world, particles can exist in multiple possible states or locations simultaneously. There's wave-particle duality, or what's called quantum superposition. Things can be smeared out over space and time. Schrodinger's cat is a thought experiment, which the cat being both dead and alive at the same time, which illustrated this possibility. And we know this happens. We know that this happens at the small scale. The question is, how small is small, and at what level does our classical, real, definite classical world appear? Another property is that once unified, quantum particles may remain connected over distances. This is quantum non-locality or entanglement, otherwise known as Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen effect or Bell's inequalities. This has been shown experimentally. You have a spin-up, spin-down system, and they're both in superposition of both. You send one along a fiber optic cable 50 miles this way, one 50 miles this way. You measure one here, and it's spin up. The other one immediately assumes spin down because they're paired, even though they're both in both until observed. And this is actually the basis of what's called quantum cryptography and quantum teleportation. This is actually being used technologically as is quantum computation. In quantum computation, we have quantum bits. Now, bits in a classical computer are 1 or 0, one or the other. In quantum computers, the bits can be in superposition of both 1 and 0, or qubits, quantum bits. While in this state, they interact, compute non-locally by this weird entanglement, and then, at a certain point, they all collapse and choose one or the other. And while they're communicating by entanglement, they're actually processing and able to do incredibly complex and efficient quantum computation. Now, the boundary between the quantum and classical worlds, the quantum state reduction or the collapse of the wave function remains mysterious, which is why Schrodinger's cat story is still around. You know, how big must the quantum system be before it will spontaneously collapse? If it's isolated from the environment. If you expose it to the environment, it will decohere. Because of that, historically, people thought consciousness collapsed the wave function. It was open the box, look at the cat, and it chose either dead or alive. But that's probably not true either. Anyway, just a couple things about quantum information, because I predict you'll be hearing more about this. There's probably going to be a technological revolution. As I mentioned, information is represented as quantum superposition, which interact by non-local entanglement. It was originally suggested in the 80s by Benioff, Feynman, and David Deutsch, and Benioff will be here for the Quantum Mind Conference. In the early 90s, Peter Shor at Bell Labs showed that, mathematically, that if they could be produced, they could do things like factoring large numbers into prime exponentially faster, which would make all military and bank codes obsolete because that's the basis of cryptography. So governments and industries started pouring a lot of money into it. Recently, they've been shown to be able to employ search and pattern recognition algorithms also. The problem was that they were very sensitive and could be decohered by a stray cosmic ray, they thought, or any thermal vibration. But they developed quantum error correction algorithms which could deal with the decoherence problem. Presently, prototypes exist. It looks like they're going to be able to be built in silicon so they can be mass-produced. So would they be conscious? Would quantum computers be conscious? Not exactly. So what's this quantum mind idea? Well, in a nutshell, consider this. Let's just say that the preconscious or the unconscious or the Freudian even subconscious is information in quantum superposition, quantum information, multiple possibilities coexisting, where paradox reigns and opposites merge to sameness. That was the quote about the unconscious, but it applies beautifully to quantum superposition. Then quantum state reduction, or the collapse of the wave function, in which the multiple possibilities choose definite classical states, is a conscious moment, or what the philosopher Whitehead called an occasion of experience. A sequence of these moments would give a stream of consciousness. So how could this possibly occur in the brain? This is from 1994, after the first Tucson conference, and a group of us went to the Grand Canyon, and the man in the yellow is Roger Penrose. And I had been working on information processing and microtubules for about 20 years, but couldn't figure out how, even if they were computers, how they could produce consciousness. Then I read his book about the quantum gravity, which I didn't really understand, but intuitively I thought he was onto something, but he didn't have a very good site or substrate for quantum gravity computation. So I contacted him and suggested that maybe the microtubules I was studying might be the key, might be his site, and in other words, he had the mechanism and I had the structure. So we got together and I invited him to the conference, and we went on this hike through the Grand Canyon. And by Indian Gardens, we were pretty delirious, and we really were able to make a lot of headway. Anyway, recall what the interior of the cell looks like it's made of these microtubules, which actually, at least if you have some an imagination, kind of look like computer lattice. They're cylindrical, made of a lattice of individual proteins which can switch back and forth. So my original idea, dating back to the 80s, was that these were like automata or computers where the state of each one influenced the neighbors and were influenced by the neighbors, and this processed information. This could give you a huge amount of computational complexity for every cell. But even so, it didn't really help with the problem of consciousness. This is what I had come up with, the idea that this is a piece of a microtubule with the blue and the white representing different conformational states, and by dipole-dipole interactions, patterns emerged and moved, and you could do actually classical, or the simulations were able to do classical computation, and I proposed this as a classical computer mechanism inside living cells. But again, it didn't really explain consciousness. So Roger and I got together and we decided, well, maybe the tubulin switching was like a qubit or quantum bit. So if you look in the middle at the top, just the black and the white would be the classical tubulin switching between two classical states. But maybe we thought the tubulin could also be in a quantum superposition of both possible states. And the reason, in which case it could act as a qubit, interact with all the others, and act like a quantum computer. And the reason that might be true is that what actually controls protein conformational dynamics, whether it's an ion channel opening or an enzyme or a receptor or a tubulin, are hydrophobic quantum mechanical forces in these hydrophobic pockets called London dispersion forces. And I knew about these because this is exactly how anesthetics work. Anesthetic gases get into these hydrophobic pockets and inhibit the quantum mechanical interactions and therefore stop the protein from working and therefore block consciousness. So these are the weakest but most numerous, and they mediate anesthetic effects. And since they couple to the protein conformational dynamics, we proposed that proteins could act as qubits. So we came up with the idea that the microtubules inside neurons, dendrites in particular, were quantum bits, and that the microtubules were part of a quantum computing network inside cells. And that the quantum information got from neuron to neuron across gap junctions, something like this, and that the microtubule-associated proteins kind of tuned the quantum states, kind of like frets in a guitar. So we came up with the name of our model, orchestrated objective reduction. Objective reduction being the type of collapse Roger suggested, which would terminate the quantum state to choose the classical states, in orchestration by the biological feedback mechanism. So basically, the idea was that the classical states would go into a quantum superposition shown as in gray, and in the quantum superposition would reach a threshold that Roger had described via quantum gravity between step 6 and 7, and collapse and choose some classical states. Something like this. So you see the three pieces of microtubules where we get emergence of quantum superposition, and we reach this threshold. There's a conscious moment, a now, if you will. The collapse occurs, we have a flash of conscious experience, and the cycle begins again, and this could happen every 25 milliseconds, or roughly 40 times a second, for example, 40 hertz. It could actually, depending on how many were involved, it could happen at various frequencies. This looks, if you know, pardon my extrapolation, trying to get Freud on my side, but this looks a little like this idea of reaching a threshold from subconscious and then into consciousness, which is kind of what we're saying. Cognitively, this might work something like this. Say you're walking down the street and you see a woman's face. You sort of recognize her. Is it Amy, Betty, or Carol? But you're not sure, so you have a quantum superposition of all three possibilities, and finally you recognize, aha, it's Carol, and you have this conscious moment. Oh, hi, Carol. Or you're trying to decide what to have for dinner, shrimp, sushi, or pasta. You have a quantum superposition of all possibilities, and for some reason, you're not sure why, but okay, you'll have sushi. Now, obviously, this could be done by classical algorithmic processes, but there's some significant advantages of it being a quantum computation. So a series of these collapses or reductions or moments, say every 25 milliseconds, on the top would be normal experience. In B would be anesthesia, just blocks it all together. You just don't have any consciousness. If you're excited or enchanted for some reason, you have an increased slope, and you have more conscious events per time. So the outward world would slow down, if you will. And the height of the collapse is greater, so you have more intense experiences. In an altered state of whatever kind, you might actually go into the quantum state and not reach threshold, so that you would merge your consciousness with what's normally subconscious in the subconscious phase. And dreaming might look something like that.